What does it mean to time travel? We will take a look at that question on this episode of the Sci Fi Show. In Star Trek The Next Generation, there's a two-part episode called Time's Arrow that straddles the Season 5 and 6 break. In Time's Arrow, the crew of the Enterprise learn of a strange discovery. The head of Commander Data has been found during an archaeological dig on Earth, and it appears to have been sitting buried in a cave for several centuries. An additional discovery of some fossilized cells lead the crew to the planet Davidia 2, where they find a strange cavern. In this cavern, beings are discovered and an accident happens and Commander Data is transported back in time to the 1880s. Other members of the crew end up trapped in the past as well, and adventures ensue. We learn later in the episode that, in terms of the sequence of events, Data's loss of his head happens in the middle of events, and even though the gap between when he loses his head and it's reattached is measured in centuries, for the other members of the crew the amount of time is measured in minutes. Such as a likely outcome of time travel and the subjective passage of time for the traveller. So what is time? Philosophically, this turns out to be quite an involved question and difficult to work out. Two simple and non-controversial definitions are time is what clocks measure and time is what stops everything happening at once. Although these definitions are true, they do leave a lot of open questions to explore. There are a lot of ways to conceptualize the nature of time, but let's start with two competing ideas. They are known as the dynamic and static theories of time. The way to think about the static theory is to take seriously the idea is time is what prevents everything from happening at once. All time already exists, and your life consists of travelling along this time dimension from one point to another. It all exists and in one sense happens all at once, but we perceive it as the linear passage of time. There may or may not be a privileged now in this scheme of things, but there certainly doesn't have to be. The other conception, the dynamic conception, says that there is a now, and the future isn't yet written. There is no future for you to pass through until you get to it. On the static conception of time, there's no real difference between the nature of the past, the present, and the future. They already all exist. There may be a privileged now that traverses this block of time, but there doesn't have to be. On the dynamic theory, there's a real difference between past, present, and future. The past may be fixed in a similar way to the way all time is on the static theory, but perhaps only the present is real and both past and future are effectively unwritten. One thing I think is interesting is that perhaps the laws of physics give some insight into the nature of time. One strange observation about the laws of physics is that the mathematical description of reality contains a time component in many instances, but that time doesn't need to have a direction. The math works just as well in either direction. Whether this will tell us something about the nature of time or it's simply an artifact of the way we represent the laws is an open question. Perhaps we'll discover new representations that work and have a concrete direction to them. I'm not sure what will happen if that direction turns out to be backwards. Is time travel compatible with either of these conceptions of time? It depends what happens when you travel in time. In Time's Arrow, Captain Picard comments that they're trying to prevent Data from losing his head when they're investigating things on Davidia 2. Data observes that this is impossible. It has already happened. Data will at some future point lose his head in 1800s America. One problem with time travel is that it does make a mess of tensed language. Picard's attempt to save Data and prevent the loss of his head raises a similar problem to that of the grandfather paradox. That classic time travel puzzle of what happens if I travel back in time and shoot my grandfather, preventing my father and myself from being born. Who shoots my grandfather? If they save Data from losing his head, how will they find the head that led them on this quest in the first place? The answer may be very simple. In the normal sequence of events, we travel through time in one direction. The past is lost to us and the future is to be discovered. We have a timeline. Now, this will still be true if we travel forward in time. In reality, we are all time travelers. We just do it by traveling forward in time at the rate of 60 seconds a minute. Even if I could travel forward at a rate greater than that, time would still be a line, although perhaps with a gap where I travelled forward. Travel forward in time, at least subjectively, could be achieved easily enough if we ever perfected some form of suspended animation, at least from the perspective of the traveller. Travel at speeds approaching light and the time dilation effects that go along with that will provide a similar effect. But what happens if we travel back in time? Suddenly a person's timeline will contain a loop as they travel along a segment of time that is in their past towards a future they left. Even if they travel a long way into the past, the loop will still be there. Or will it? It seems there are two possibilities here. If I travel back in time, although I may be traveling back into my own past, it is possible that I create a new universe at that point, creating a new timeline from the one I started from, much like creating a fork in the road. Whether I can then travel forward and get home again is another question. Perhaps I am trapped in this new timeline and can only travel forward again into that future. The other possibility is that there's only one timeline and I'll be altering my own real future if I do anything in the past. So what does this mean for the grandfather paradox? If I create a new timeline when I travel back, then there's no problem at all. I can shoot as many of my predecessors as I like, it won't affect my existence because in a real sense, none of these people are my predecessors. All of my ancestors are on my original timeline and were never murdered by anyone, at least not before they produced the next progenitor in my line. If such a conception of time is true, and it is possible to get back to your original timeline, it does suggest a rather simple solution to the problem of resource depletion. Simply travel back in time before a resource was mined, although only just before, and then exploit it, and send the resources home. Then repeat going back a further 5 minutes from your starting point, and repeat back as far as you like up to the time the original resource was created. This would be a good way to clone unique artifacts like the Mona Lisa and other things. Of course, you'll be depriving the future timeline you create of whatever you do take with you. The paradox only exists if I'm altering my actual future. If there's only one stream of time and I'm travelling back into my own past, rather than a new timeline, then a paradox will result if I shoot my grandfather. Or will it? If I do shoot my grandfather, there's the obvious problem that nobody will be available to conceive my father because I've just killed them, preventing me from undertaking this convoluted method of suicide. There have been a number of interesting stories written along this line, and author Paul Levinson wrote an interesting tale called the Chronology Protection Case that invokes something called the Chronology Protection Conjecture put forward by Stephen Hawking. The basic idea is that the universe won't let you create a paradox like that. Reality itself will conspire against you to prevent the paradox. A less extreme possibility is that it'll be impossible to kill your grandfather because you never managed to kill your grandfather, much like Data's head. You can't prevent an event that has already happened because it's already happened, even if it is in the future of your own personal timeline. There are also other possibilities. Perhaps it's impossible to disrupt the future that much, that over longer time frames, any changes a person makes in the past are washed away like the disturbances a rock makes when you toss it in a river. It makes a splash, but a bit further down the river, all traces of the rock's disturbance have been swallowed up in the noise of the river itself. Perhaps if you killed your grandfather, someone else will just end up filling the spot. Another possibility has been explored by Ray Bradbury in his short story A Sound of Thunder, where a dinosaur hunter in the past makes a tiny change. He steps off the carefully prepared path and crushes a butterfly, and the entire future is thrown onto a wildly different path. A similar idea was explored in The Simpsons' Halloween Special 5 in the story Time and Punishment, where Homer makes the same mistake at first after he accidentally builds a time machine while trying to repair the toaster, and hilarity ensues. This conception of time would suggest that it's much more like the weather, where even a tiny change will propagate chaotically into the future and in ways that cannot be foreseen. There is one other paradox of time travel that I've always found fascinating, although I haven't seen it explored in fiction much. It is a question of the generation of information. Assuming we live on a single timeline and I affect my actual past, what is to stop me from reading up on special relativity and then travelling back to 1908 and explaining the idea to a certain patent clerk and letting him plagiarise the idea for a physics paper? This presents a strange case of information generation from nothing. It's the opposite of the grandfather paradox. At no point did anybody come up with the idea of special relativity. My understanding was taken from Einstein's work, and Einstein stole the idea from me when I explained it to him. Perhaps it's a paradox like this that makes time travel impossible, rather than that of a rampaging collection of people out to kill their grandfathers. Certainly, if you could do this, it would make getting everything in your life easy. You don't need to do anything, you just need to crib the answers from future you. I hope you've enjoyed this taste of time. The philosophy of time is a deep topic and we couldn't hope to cover it all in the available time, but I will return to the question in future episodes. You can find more information on the different ideas contained in this episode in the show notes on scifishow.com. I can also be reached with comments via thescifishow@gmail.com. You can leave comments in the show notes at scifishow.com, and you can leave comments on our Facebook page, facebook.com/scifishow. You can also follow the show via The Sci-Fi Show on Twitter. If there's a topic you'd like me to look into, please don't hesitate to ask. And don't forget, it's Phi with a PH. Let me know what you think. The Sci-Fi Show is recorded under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 3.0 license, and the music is by Furious J and Maniacal M.